Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you all to ET Telecom webinar. To present this webinar, I welcome Mr. Rajan Matthews, Director General, Cellular Operators Association of India, on the topic Telecom Industry's Views on National Digital Communications Policy 2018. There will be a presentation on the topic followed by a question and answer session wherein you may submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Now I request Mr. Rajan Matthews to start the presentation. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. The much awaited National Digital Communications Policy 2018, which is now called NDCP 2018. Previous nomenclature was NTP 2018, but now the focus on digital communications, it's called NDCP. That has just come out a couple of days ago, last week, and it's now available for public comment. So we would just like to go through the details what is included in there and focus on precisely what the association is looking from the industry perspective to enhance and amplify. So I just want to have the first two slides talk about what is really included in NDCP policy. And here on the first slide, you see the objectives of the policy, and it talks about broadband for all, creating 4 million additional jobs, enhancing contribution of digital communications to 8% of India's GDP, and propelling India to the top 50 nations in the ICT Development Index, and enhancing IT's contribution to global value chains, that is the Indian contribution, and ensuring digital sovereignty. So those are the principal focus of the policy. So if you go to the next one, you'll see the vision and mission statement spelled out very clearly. I just want to look at the mission aspects. There are three components to the mission, which is Propel India, Connect India, Secure India, and Propel India will focus on the aspects of what it takes to get India to the forefront. You saw the mission statement objectives. And when you now look at the three criteria, Propel India has to talk about what it takes for us to get there. Connect India focuses on addressing industry association or industry issues. And Secure India talks about how we secure our networks and digital privacy and digital security aspects of our networks and the customer experience. So those are the three areas. So what I'd like to do is address each one of those in its unique and individual characteristics. So let's start with the draft policy. It says the proposal is to address the financial sort of woes of the sector, if you will, or the challenges of the sector. And we've been talking, in addition to addressing the debt burden, we've talked about the recurring fees, which today account for about 30% or so of total revenue off the top. So we've asked the government to address the issue of license fees, spectrum usage charge, the other GST charges, which are at 18%. So some of these issues are the focus areas. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, now you'll see that it talks about the areas that we've highlighted. So these are the areas that the COI has submitted in terms of its focus in terms of addressing the issue. The next issue is the long-term quality sustainability investments in order to attract $100 billion. One of the things that the policy has talked about is that in order to effectuate all of the objectives of the policy, we need to ensure that we can attract 100 billion. We've said that this is kind of a conservative estimate if we want to drive to 8% of the GDP. So our submission has talked about rolling out of broadband internet services, talking about the entrusting one agency responsible for the whole sector. There's sort of one window clearance in order to get all of this working together, to work towards telecom services, to have access, long-term access for infrastructure debt that is to be sort of positioned in terms of the fund, just like the development funds that are available to create this type of fund because of the large outlays required. We've talked about issues like tax-free bonds as a means of raising this type of money, and we've talked about creating a telecom finance corporation to handle the specifics of lending to the industry, because again, these are long-term gestation periods, and so we need this type of specialized focus in terms of lending to the industry, right? So the next one is the draft policy focus on licensing and regulatory regime that will catalyze investments for the innovations and the ease of doing business aspects of furthering the interests of the industry. Unbundling of different layers, infrastructure, network services. Here's the sort of horizon, the new horizon that we are talking about in terms of the networks and services. We are now moving towards the era of software-defined networks, everything as a service, slicing of our networks, 5G coming and making all of these things feasible. So if you focus on that aspect of the policy, the COI submission focused on administrative approaches so that no equipment is held up through the imposition of import licenses. The SACFA is really clearances of spectrum. So these are things that could come as impediments. We've talked about a uniform policy for security, interception, and privacy for customers, settle disputes through of LF and SF, simplify assessments of adjusted gross revenue, to take effective steps to reduce ongoing legal disputes between DOT and TSPs in some of these areas. All regulatory financial filing should be done certainly and not at the circle level. So we're talking about the fact of moving from a 22 circle to a centralized aspect of policy and administration. The next area that we've talked about is the spectrum policy, recognizing that the policy talks about spectrum as a national resource. We've talked about additional spectrum bands coming online, 5G spectrum bands that are in the 3 to 24 gigahertz range. Again, promoting effective utilization of high capacity backhaul E and V bands. Those are being highlighted, and the reason we've been focusing on E and V bands is because obviously these are, in terms of throughput and speed, almost close to fiber, and since fiber can't always be implemented, especially in our urban areas, E and V bands become extremely critical. And then we're talking about making available spectrum bands for both access and backhaul for timely deployment and growth of 5G networks. So these are the policy prescriptions, and when you look at the COI submission, we said give us a roadmap for spectrum. We talk about the harmonization of spectrum for international sort of ITU-based international harmonization, so interoperability of our networks with global networks. Also from a manufacturing perspective, all of that can happen. We've talked about the delicensing of certain bands, but we are talking about the fact that all access spectrum basically be subject to allocation through auction process, and that when we are using the spectrum, any backhaul spectrum really needs to be bundled with access spectrum. And so in that sense, you know, the delicensing of bands only is for Wi-Fi applications as it presently stands. All other spectrum bands are to be used through licensing mechanisms, and this is so that we can control issues of availability and allocation and interference. All of these things are very, very important when dealing with spectrum oriented matters. We want high capacity backhaul, and again we've emphasized the need for E and V bands, so the government is in alignment with that. And we've again talked about moderate spectrum pricing. This is an extremely important matter because as you go to 5G implementation, each operator will require 100 megahertz of spectrum at a minimum. So if we are to keep up with the global growth and development of 5G, this is the amount of spectrum that will be required. If we continue to price it at the old methodology, there'll be nobody in India that will be able to afford these large amounts of money vis-a-vis these big chunks of spectrum that are required. Moving on to the draft policy again, We were talking about incentives, exemptions for construction of telecom towers. Obviously, we've been experiencing issues of call drops and coverage areas. So the problem is being able to get timely permissions for the location of our cell towers, for the laying of fiber. So we've talked about infrastructure, that will need to be given on a timely basis, public utility status for the industry. Again, we've talked about focusing on collaborative institutional mechanisms to create, the rollout obligations and the rollout of our networks, so that the center, the states, the gram panchayats, the local municipalities can work in tandem to give us rights away and not allow us to run pillar to post. So the ease of doing business when it comes to rolling out infrastructure is critical. Establishment of the national digital grid by creating a national fiber authority, because again, we're talking about shared infrastructure. No longer can anybody, and especially operators, continue to double and triple up on capacity and on facilities. Sharing is the need of the hour. We've already initiated this on the tower side. We've initiated this in terms of our core networks. And so we're talking about now fiber also becoming a part of the shared infrastructure. Again, creating a broadband readiness index. We want to make sure that states begin to understand what they would lose if they are not keeping up with the broadband penetration and implementation of digital services. So we are creating this index which will be used to compare the status and effectiveness of what each state is doing vis-a-vis these national policies. Going to the next one, again, the COI submission is clearly articulated there. Liberalization, active and passive infrastructure sharing, simplify the right-of-way policy. We have a very good gazetted notification, making sure that it can get rolled out into the local levels. We want to make sure that our buildings now, as part of the building code, the implementation and installation of fiber-oriented cabling that's in there. We want to make sure that we have a single window clearance for government lands and buildings. Again, making sure that our buildings are infrastructure ready for the application of 5G. And also ensuring that from a legal perspective, that when infrastructure is damaged because of vandalism, others, this is treated seriously. We have an enormous amount of fiber cuts and cell towers being taken off air in bringing to a halt our services. So we've talked about some type of a mechanism that can allow the enforcement of the safety of this equipment and the fiber. Again, going to the next area, draft policy, tapping into opportunities, a detailed roadmap for emerging technologies, all right, implementing an additional plan for 5G rollout. I'm glad to say that the government is already taking the lead in looking at 5G, looking at best practices, looking at standards, looking at the development of innovative clusters for 5G, test beds, identifying the spectrum bands, allowing some spectrum bands to be used for testing purposes and R&D purposes. So a lot of work going on in the 5G. And again, our policy is outlined again in terms of the new technologies coming on, harmonized policy, regulatory treatment for competing communication services, a regulatory approach to light touch, a light touch regulatory approach to encourage innovation and growth. All of these things are critical in terms of making sure that the policy that the government is enunciating for the 5G and new technology rollouts goes smoothly. And again, we want to ensure that impediments like artificial standards and artificial certifications are done away with, and proper standards and proper certification be introduced. All right, going on to the next draft policy, data protection. Of course, this is a issue that is dear and near to the hearts of all of us. The government is actually very concerned about this. The Supreme Court has ruled in terms of privacy being a fundamental right. So we have to be very, very concerned about data protection, the protection of our networks. Foreign entities and domestic entities who have no interest in our networks at heart, making sure that they don't infringe upon the security of our networks. Again, COI has submitted that we should have a robust privacy, security, and ownership policy in place, and no exceptions should be made for any service provider including OTT communication service providers. They are now integrated. They are part of our networks. They are part of our services. So we can't afford to have vulnerabilities as a result of certain people being excluded from the security provisions of what we're trying to do. Again, we've talked about network security. There's the IT issues of testing, establishing standards. So these are things that we've talked about. Again, net neutrality. The reason we've put net neutrality is here. It's becoming very evident that the present net neutrality recommendations from TRI will inhibit and prohibit the rollout of 5G networks. And this is why the US has withdrawn their previous nomenclature on net neutrality, which India adopted and continues to hold to in a recommendation. And so countries are moving away from these definitions because they find that as they move towards network slicing and these new innovative ways of configuring networks, these present definitions of net neutrality get in the way of rolling these networks and adapting these networks. Going forward again, the summary submission to create an investor-friendly environment, we're saying is that if we have to go out and raise this large amounts of money, again, it's going to be a substantial task. Financial health has to be improved. We have to make sure GST is rationalized at a much lower level to carry on the impact assessment, cost benefit analysis of regulations. Some of these regulations are not done with a cost benefit analysis, and so the industry continues to bear a heavy load in some of these regulatory initiatives. Bankruptcy code conforming license conditions to the new bankruptcy code is an essential requirement. And so with that, let me conclude and take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So we have a lot of questions. First question from Anand. What are the points that the policy has failed to address?
I think that the policy is a very comprehensive one because it solicited input from all of the stakeholders over a lengthy period of time. There were something like 11 to 12 committees set up by the DOT to solicit inputs from just about everybody who felt that they wanted to. So this is a very, very comprehensive document. And remember, it's focused in terms of digital communications. So obviously, those are the boundary conditions. So when you look at those, we really don't think there's much of anything that is excluded from what is in the recommendations at present.
Next question from Rishi. How high are India's spectrum base price compared to global average? What was it in the case of 3G and 4G spectrum auctions?
On average, Rishi, we are about 30% more expensive per megahertz, even on a purchasing power parity basis, when you consider the cost that we have paid for spectrum through the auction process over the last several years. So 30% more of a premium compared to similar bands that have been auctioned and paid for by international countries. Operators in these countries.
So question from Sandeep. What are the main takeaway for the enterprise segment?
The enterprise segment, clearly, as we move over to the Internet of Things, cloud computing, machine to machine, these are going to be critical components. And I think one of the matters that you see highlighted is the supply chain integration that we are talking about. So as we develop in the technology in terms of 5G, in terms of looking at, say, for example, autonomous cars, integrated manufacturing, robotics, artificial intelligence, these are all significant imperatives that are going to have a major impact on the way we do business, in the way we manufacture goods and the way we conduct services. So this is going to have a really sea change impact in terms of enterprise. So I think it's appropriately covered, and recognizing that without a robust digital communications infrastructure, it'll be very, very difficult for our enterprises, our small and medium sized companies and our large ones, to effectively compete on the global stage.
A question from Rajiv. Given that mobility broadband and home fixed broadband are two sides of the same coin, how should we read these recommendations in the context of home broadband?
So I think it's an integrated approach. I think that those old distinctions that you have between mobility, landline, FTH, cable, all of these various means by which one delivers broadband either to your home, to your car, to wherever it is that you're working, whether it's on the beach or whether it's in your office or whether it's in other areas. It's going to be an in sort of what we call an integrated heterogeneous network using multiple layers of network that will deliver the types of customer experience that you are looking for as a customer. So if you're doing streaming video, that part of the network, this is what we call slicing of the network, that part of the network which is focused on giving you an extremely good high-speed customer satisfying experience for streaming video would be configured to give you that. And in order to do that, obviously you will need access to fiber and very robust last mile. So the network that you will be using will be configured dynamically to ensure that your experience is the best. So all of these elements of the network are being put together in a new way so that we can focus on everything as a circus, as a service, and this new concept that is emerging of slicing of networks. And in order for this to work, the newer technologies of 5G will be absolutely essential.
Here's the last question. This is from Anshuman. Can you shed some light on the total investment that would be made by telecom companies under this new policy? Continued. Also, do you think the companies will be able to make these huge investments as they are already overburdened with so many additional costs?
Yeah, Anshuman, I think that's a good point in terms of raising the concern, but also placing the concern in the context of the opportunity. We ought not to forget both sides of the equation. There's a tremendous amount of opportunity that is emerging as a result of what the communications policy has just laid out, the digital communications policy. We've talked about IoT, we've talked about machine to machine, we've talked about cloud computing, we've talked about 5G, we've talked about enabling a sort of artificial intelligence, robotics, virtual reality, just a plethora of stuff that is going to enhance the ability of enterprises to be more competitive, for consumers to enjoy various aspects of their living better, to have a customer experience that's truly satisfactory, to utilize it for government services. All of this we are saying is absolutely necessary to ride on a robust digital communications network. So that being said, yes, you're right. The present situation where the industry that is required to make these types of investments is in financial distress. What are we looking for? The DOT secretary herself has talked about 100 billion US dollars in the next 3 to 5 years. We think that's a conservative number. Already you are looking at our 3 or 4 main operators. When you look at Geo, when you look at Airtel, Idea, Voda, cumulatively today, they have committed already for investment in their networks approximately 10 billion US dollars over the next 3 to 4 years. So you're already talking about 30 to 40 billion US dollars over the next 2 to 3 years invested by the major operators. In order to continue that, we continue to ensure that we can attract investments, and the bulk of these investments are going to have to come from foreign sources because our domestic banks have pretty much tapped out in terms of lending to the industry. So we're going to have to look at foreign institutions, we're going to have to look at foreign sources, and in order to be able to attract this level and quantum of investments, the financial health of the industry is paramount. And that is well recognized in the policy document. And that's why when you talk about enabling this whole provisioning of the policy, the focus on reducing the levies, looking at ease of doing business, and making sure that funds are available through specialized investment vehicles and banks are all included in the policy document.
All right. With that, we'll wrap up this today's session. Thank you, Mr. Rajan Matthews, Director
Thank
General,
you.
Cellular Operators Association of India, for the presentation on the topic Telecom Industry's Views on National Digital Communications Policy 2018. It was an engaging and insightful talk, and hope all the participants have enjoyed the session. The recording of this webinar will be made available on ettelecom.com. Thank you everyone for joining us. Goodbye.
Goodbye.